Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free CompTIA A+ certification training course. I'm James Messer, and this module we're going to talk about motherboard form factors. This comes from our CompTIA requirements 220-701 section 1.2. We need to explain motherboard components, types, and features, especially form factors. So we're going to talk about ATX form factor, BTX form factor, micro ATX, and NLX. A lot of different abbreviations there for these different motherboard form factors. But these motherboard form factors are pretty important. The reason there are so many different types is that there's so many different kinds of computers that do so many different things. Motherboard form factors are, of course, the size of the system. We need to really think about where this motherboard is going, the size of the case. Is it going to sit on a desk? Is it going to sit beside a desk? And so different size motherboards allow us to do different things with the systems themselves. There's also on every motherboard a basic layout of the things that you'll need. We'll look at that in this particular video of exactly what we'll see on the motherboard. There's small changes between the different types, but the same basic structure is there. It's like a little city that we're looking down on, and for every city you need to have certain things always in all of those. The power is also different between motherboards, but only slightly. There's some very specific standards for power so that you can mix and match. You can get a motherboard and get a power supply and be pretty sure that the power supply and the motherboard will plug into each other just fine. There's also a concern with motherboards that there is a specific set of airflow that you have going across it. These motherboards get really, really hot. There are a lot of different components on them. The CPUs themselves really heat up. There are fans on the motherboard. There's heat sinks, and you always have to have this flow of air going over the motherboard. And so the different motherboard form factors support different kinds of airflow and different ways of getting the cool air to these components. If you want to look at all the different motherboard types, I went out to Wikipedia just before writing up this particular presentation. There are 26 different motherboard types listed in Wikipedia. So it's pretty good that we're only going to talk about 4 in this particular module, and only 4 that you have to know for your CompTIA A+ exam, because going through 26 different motherboards, you could be here a while. Fortunately, we'll only look at the top 4. There's really not a huge difference in size between different motherboards, but I thought this would be a nice thing to show, is that you have some motherboards that are pretty long, like the NLX motherboard. You have others that are really, really short, or the smallest one that's on here, which is a micro ATX motherboard. So all of these have different sizes, different shapes, but almost all of them have similar sizes because they all have to fit into exactly the right case. When you buy a case for your computer, the case is going to be bought with the idea of telling you this is a case for a micro ATX motherboard. This is a case for a BTX motherboard. So you have to make sure your case matches the motherboard so that it's able to screw in and sit properly inside of the case. And that's why you'll see motherboards will generally all have the exact same size or something close to it, depending on whether it's ATX or NLX or micro ATX, so that it fits the case exactly without having any problems with one being too big or too small once you put the two together. Perhaps the most common motherboard type is an ATX form factor. This ATX has been around an awfully long time. This ATX stands for Advanced Technology Extended, and it's something that Intel put together in 1995. There have been a number of updates through the years. Different types of motherboards have come from the ATX form factor, but if you go out and you're looking to buy a new case for a computer, you'll see a lot of cases available for ATX motherboards, and you'll see a lot of ATX motherboards that are out there available for sale. The power connectors on ATX differ, though, depending on when you happen to get the motherboard. A lot of the older ATX motherboards have a 20-pin connector, but there are newer connectors on the ATX motherboards for 24 pins. It's a different ATX power supply standard. And so there are additional connectors on the motherboards, additional components that you would plug into these motherboards, additional drives and technologies that have required additional power. So if you're getting a new motherboard and you're getting a new power supply, get one that's got 24-pin power on it. You'll be much better off, especially in the future if you ever plan to upgrade and add more to that device. There are a number of different form factors that have different back plates. It's very modular. This ATX was built so that you could put almost anything in the back of it, but the motherboard would still be the same size. And you can remove the back plate, add different components to it. Very modular in the type of motherboard you're getting. So if you replace a motherboard with a new ATX motherboard that has different ports on it, it's okay. The back plate still is going to fit perfectly in your computer. At least in most cases it does. That is an idea behind this, is that if you ever need to replace a motherboard, just keep the case you have. If you replace an ATX with an ATX, you're probably in good shape. And as I mentioned, if you go out and look at the websites of what's available to buy, you can still get ATX motherboards today. It's been a very, very popular format. The ATX motherboard itself, this is a picture of one, very basic, very, very straightforward. One thing to make note of here is that the memory slots go one direction and your expansion slots go exactly a 90-degree angle to that. And notice that the processor, there's no processor in here, but the slot for the processor is also squared up with those. It's not at an angle. So a lot of right angles on the ATX motherboard, right angles for your memory and your expansion slots and the processor. And if you're looking at a picture of an ATX motherboard, it will look very similar to this every single time with all of those right angles. So if you're looking at being able to identify motherboards by sight, that's a good way to do it for an ATX motherboard. After ATX was created, another motherboard format came out called a BTX form factor. BTX stands for Balanced Technology Extended. I'm not sure why we put names to these. Nobody calls it Balanced Technology Extended. We all call it BTX. I guess we had to get the BTX from somewhere, didn't we? The BTX motherboard was a little bit smaller, but it was a little bit wider. So it fit into a completely different case. So you really couldn't fit this into an ATX case. This really was very specific for BTX. And the reason we created it, this new format, why would you need another format that was basically the same size? The idea is that we were taking the ideas of the ATX and making it better. Make it so that we could dissipate more heat. Make it so that it was much easier for airflow to come across this motherboard, and so that all of that heat that would be on that motherboard would be much easier to cool later on. And very much straight lines down the view of this BTX form factor. The problem is it really wasn't very popular. It didn't last very long. They're no longer in production. You really can't find them, at least not that I've been able to find. There are many motherboards, though, that took the idea of BTX and they built their own proprietary motherboards. You can't really call them BTX, you can't really call them ATX. They're ones that are made by Gateway, they're made by Dell, they're made by third parties, and it is a Dell motherboard that is designed to fit specifically in a Dell case. But the idea behind BTX and some of the advantages of the engineering remain, even though it's not a completely official BTX style, still uses a lot of the same engineering that came from that. And here's the idea. If you remember with the ATX motherboard, there were a lot of right angles. So you had a lot of expansion slots that were different than the memory slots. And so the airflow wasn't exactly one that was perfect through the system. But look at a BTX motherboard. The memory slots and the expansion slots all go the same direction. So now it's much easier to pull the air directly into your system. This cool air would be pulled in and all go straight through without having to be blocked or stopped by anything. So this was a great idea, this BTX. And you can see why other manufacturers said, we'll take that idea and we'll use it in some of our proprietary, because after all, who's going to swap out a Dell computer with a different motherboard in there? At least that's their thinking. Notice also the processor is at a 45-degree angle to those. So a little bit different in the processor and the way that it fits on there. So it's very easy visually when you look at this motherboard, very easy for you to look at that and go, oh, that's BTX. Look how everything flows in one direction. Look how the processor is at that little 45-degree angle. So if anybody showed you the difference between BTX and ATX, it should be pretty obvious right off the bat.